Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Jason Isbell and the 400 unit Weathervanes. The conversation about Jason Isbell has always been complicated if you were willing to read between the lines. But after 2020, it was not that difficult to see the cracks. And that's not referring to the music quality at all, at least on the surface, because I went back to 2020's reunions expecting to be underwhelmed or that the album had aged kind of weirdly in the context of that year of lockdown. But no, it's actually held up ridiculously well. It joins the acclaimed run that may have started earlier, but was certainly cemented by 2013's Southeastern. And while many will consider that project an indie country classic, I still think 2015's Something More Than Free is actually even better. But you can argue that the run of albums produced by Dave Cobb from 2013 to 2020, it's top tier among any singer-songwriter working today, or even many historically. The closest competitor in my books as of recently, it's Laurie McKenna, but at that point I am splitting hairs among giants. But on reunions, you couldn't help but hear the anxiety, the darker, brittle tinges that highlighted a deeper, unsettling fracture. Certainly fit the times, especially as his political side grew ever more charged while never losing its populism. But that was not what sparked the most concern. No, that was the flickers of instability in his marriage to fellow artist Amanda Shires, who played fiddle on that album and was a counterweight that, if you were aware, you couldn't ignore. It grew all the more pronounced 2 years later in 2022 when Amanda Shires herself released the album Take It Like a Man, with Jason Isbell playing guitar. And there were more than a few songs on that project that felt like the lemonade to Jason Isbell's 444. The tension was undeniable. More interesting was what it seemed to do to Jason Isbell's public image, of which I've always felt is a little distorted from the reality of his music. His humanity and his flaws, from the struggle of sobriety to the constant struggle to be a better man while aware of the political weight that he now carries. To me, it didn't place him on a pedestal, but for a lot of folks it did, of which Jason Isbell may never have been properly comfortable, which led to the music documentary this year, Running With Our Eyes Closed, which highlighted the worst possible sides of him and his relationship in the creation of Reunions, putting on video exactly everything that had crept out in the press run at that time of that album. It's not really a comfortable watch, mostly because, like the best music documentaries, it forces you to confront your idols at their messiest, but it did feel like a necessary one, if a bit delayed from an earlier release, probably because of the pandemic. All this then placed Weathervanes in a very interesting context for me, departing from working with Dave Cobb on production and Jason Isbell assuming production duties himself for a considerably longer album. I mean, I knew it was going to be great, the standards are that high, but I still had reservations. I knew there was probably going to be continuations of themes from Reunions and maybe even Take It Like a Man, but I was most concerned about the production here. Jason Isbell has produced before, including one of the best American aquarium albums with Burn, Flicker, Die back in 2012, one of the best albums of the 2010s, but for as much as many were claiming that this was his best project since Southeastern, I really wanted to take this in properly, fully digest it. So what did we get? Whew, okay. So some of you might be surprised that this review is as late as it is. Given how much I'm a very obvious fan of Jason Isbell for the past decade, you would think I'd have everything ready to go a lot earlier. But after my first couple of listens, which again took a while, this is a pretty long album, I knew I had to give this time so I was sure on my opinion. I knew I needed to let this sink in, let the songwriting really marinate for me, really give this one some sober thoughts and then some not so sober thoughts. Jason Isbell's one of the greats of capturing the best of both. And having done so, yeah, I'm convinced. This is the album to beat in 2023, and I don't think it's particularly close. A jaw-dropping, diverse, thematic culmination that recognizes its roots while digging around them to some of the most emotionally raw set pieces Jason Isbell has ever crafted. Moreover, it's the sort of album that I could pitch to damn near anyone. I mean, the country and southern rock fans would easily get on board, but I know enough metalheads who would hear the vivid detail of his storytelling and gravitate to this instantly. Hell, maybe even some hip-hop heads as well. Even pop fans Look, in the week ahead, on the top 2 songs on the Hot 100, they're projected to be from Morgan Wallen and Luke Combs. Zach Bryan is charting hits. The crossover is already in the marketplace of ideas. This could work on the Hot 100 today. I'll say it. And we'd all be better for it. Now, that is a loaded assertion. And the immediate question that comes out of it is, well, can I get on board with this album? Or do I need to go through the massive back catalog from Jason Isbell? I mean, of course, I would recommend that. It's a great listening experience, but I would not say it's essential. This is a project that feels like the natural continuation of his growth and arc from the past decade, but the callbacks are predominantly in the details that won't reveal themselves on first listen, and the hooks are considerably more immediate. They'll get you on board right away. I chalk a lot of this up from the pivot from Dave Cobb, where in retrospect, it might have been exactly what Jason Isbell needed to inject a surge of vibrant color back into his mixes. There might be a little less refinement because nobody mics a fiddle better than Dave Cobb, but that's balanced out by Isbell bringing in a diversity of acoustic and electric tones in the guitars, complementing Amanda Shires' fiddle with accordion and piano and organ, and finally giving his song some tangible muscle in the bass grooves and percussion. This is easily Isbell's most energetic, expansive, and, well, driving album since his days of the Drive-By Truckers. And that Southern rock DNA rears its head a number of times, but always with thematic purpose. And that's where this album picks up so much more added resonance, especially if you're paying attention. Now take, for example, the opening track, Death Wish, which, I mean, fuck, if you've ever dated someone with depression, it is built to wreck you right out of the damn gate. The details are so exacting. But it's also a necessary transition from the Dave Cobb era of production to, well, the rest of Weathervanes. It's brittle, it's haunted, it's jagged. The pickups can be borderline post-punk at places, where the slightly raw vocals fit someone anxiously on that brink. An in medias res opening that if you've heard Reunions and Take It Like a Man, you know exactly where it's coming from, but it's so gripping and borderline gothic that it demands your attention to wherever the hell he's gonna go next. It also establishes the themes very starkly. Just how much Jason Isbell can control and what he can't. If Southeastern was the album built out of personal recovery, and Something More Than Free was the attempt to close the door on his past, only for the Nashville sound to highlight that that was never going to really happen, and Reunions then show him attempt to muscle through it all, cling to his own self-righteousness, this is the project that shows the very stark limitations of his power, especially amidst forces that are and will always be beyond his control, especially other people. It's about living within those systems and seeing the consequences of those systems changing or being stretched to the very brink. And one realization comes to the forefront very quickly. Men, especially men like Jason Isbell, who are raised to be the strong, silent Southern man with an entrenched set of values that are placed all the more in focus by attaining power, I mean, we don't handle those sorts of changes or stretches all that well. And their ignorance of others, especially women in the same frame, can trigger consequences they might not see coming. A really great example of this is how Jason Isbell utilizes Southern rock on this album that might call back to the 1970s and acts like the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner. The guitars are warm, the grooves are very gentle and inviting, the progressions are allowed to meander and build and jam out a bit. The sort of material that's many guys, especially sports writers, they love to put this music on of this type for when they're barbecuing, but midway through the song you realize that lack of consideration has led to some of those warm, comforting moments to be, not always so comforting to everyone else. The most stark early example is Middle of the Morning, a song written from lockdown in the middle of tensions in his marriage and a world that's spiraling beyond what he can actually control, where amidst that comforting, sandy atmosphere, lines like, "I know you're scared of me," they ring out. Or take This Ain't It, pure Southern rock full of extended jamming and organ, written from the perspective of an absentee father trying to re-enter his wayward daughter's life, give her some very well-meaning advice. And I'm sorry, it reads as nothing more than Jason Isbell writing his own Buddy's Rendezvous by Father John Misty, framed positively until you recognize how irrelevant and pathetic pathetic it can ultimately feel. Because one thing that I do find very interesting is that while I thought some of Jason Isbell's conservative critics highlighting his hubris on reunions, it was kind of misguided, to put it lightly. He was making some good points, but it was clear that he took some of that to heart, and Weathervanes is trying to dig into both his own state and what shaped him to be like this. And that sort of systemic introspection is not exactly easy, especially when there are plenty who are running short on patience to have to deal with him and grapple with his consequences. If You Insist is an intentional follow-up to Chaos and Close from the Nashville sound, especially in the watery guitars balanced out with the fiddle and that fast picking. But where that song was trying to be a little bit more conciliatory to someone who, let's be honest, really did not deserve it, here there is no breakthrough. The passage of time leaves him feeling all the more stranded in attempting to reach out. When We Were Close falls into a similar vein with a fellow rock star who died of his addictions, with the chunkier riffs a deliberate callback, but where Jason Isbell wonders why it wasn't him to succumb. He had been an addict around that time. He's not a better man than his old friend. And an earlier song like King of Oklahoma, with the aching electric snarl and the interweaving solos where he lives out the life of someone ravaged by opiate addiction, who sees his marriage and his life and his prospects implode. He's only blearily realizing the horrifying impact that he's had on all those around him. But at that point at the very bottom, he just can't feel anything at all. He's trying to feel something. And then on Vestavia Hills, he becomes explicitly self-critical. It's written from the perspective of a roadie who's been trying to prop up an artist who might have been considered a boy genius, but is falling apart at the seams, trying to maintain that power. But then he throws up the double bird and realizes he could and should find a better life elsewhere. But that's the point. This is an album that is not designed to reinforce power, but critique it, and then wonder on what moral authority does he have to say anything at all here. This takes us to the two songs that are most openly about his home state of Alabama and old stories growing up, and it's a complex lens. Cast Iron Skillet is soft-spoken and acoustic, but it's all about puncturing that folksy wisdom that's not really rooted in much, and only serves to cover up some evil, some systemic rot that touches on racism and violence. And then there's Volunteer, which takes a first-person perspective, peeling through misty strings and guitars as he tries to sketch out that hometown narrative for the kids who don't get out, and how easily he could have fallen between the cracks in the same way. He can't be that nostalgic for home, even if he might actually want to be. But for as much as Isbell is a phenomenal storyteller, the poetry here is so good, where the tension is at its highest is within the family. And those are some of the most gripping moments here. I've already mentioned Death Wish, and that feels very poignant. But a brighter but no less complicated love song is Strawberry Woman, one of my personal favorites, with that warmer guitar and that striking acoustic solo at the very end. The sentiment at its roots is a really tough one, that if both you and your partner grow and mature where codependence is no longer required, you start maybe even questioning what's really keeping you together, the expectations of love that are shifting beneath your feet. And as Middle of the Morning will show, when you're pushed, even good men and women will stumble or overlook something that they really shouldn't. One of the most harrowing songs on the back half of the album is White Beretta, where Jason Isbell describes being a younger man taking a partner to get an abortion, and it's not a regret for lost fatherhood so much as just not even contextualizing what it would have meant for a young woman growing up in the Deep South in a deeply religious and deeply conservative environment where the strictures and stigmas that would have been placed on her are very different. And then there's Save the World, with its cycling, anxious guitar lines and organ that blazes almost uncomfortably bright, as Jason Isbell writes in the aftermath of the Uvalde school shooting. Not as someone who's going to make a statement on gun control, we've already heard those statements, not someone passing thoughts and prayers, but as a parent, with the paralyzing feeling nestling in his gut and the desperate hope that someone will be able to fix this broken system. And that's the tragedy of so much of Weathervanes. So much of this is beyond just the one man who might be put on the pedestal, where you have more power to damage than heal or change people, and either way, you aren't beating time, be it those who are set in their path or those who are charting anew. The final song, Miles, like Letting You Go on reunions, it's about the inevitability of his daughter growing up and then leaving, but the mood is different. Letting You Go, it's a great father-daughter ballad, but it's easy, it's more settled. Miles, meanwhile, is a 70s Paul McCartney song by way of vintage Neil Young, complete with multiple tempo changes as Jason Isbell flexes his prog side, where, like his own lineage has shaped his world, he has shaped hers, and it hasn't always been for the better, because he's not perfect. And no parent is, especially given the tension that he has had with her mother in plain sight. It's a difficult conclusion to accept that she will leave, one that ultimately feels hopeful but less certain. And you know what? That makes sense too. Weathervanes really is the perfect title because Weathervanes can trace where the wind might be blowing, but never for sure, and never for long, and never for how fast it blows. They sure as hell can't stop it. This is an album that questions direction in a very empathetic and human way, with a breadth that can finally see for miles. I mean, rarely has an album that feels so deliberate and well-crafted, showcasing so much deep-seated acknowledgement of what we do not know and cannot control. It's an album that deals in systems, but never shies away from the heart and the turns of phrase that make Isbell one of the best writers that are working today. The only concern I might have for crossover is that it can be a really heavy and adult album in many places, and with a decidedly masculine focus on a lot of its framing. Honestly, that's one of the main points that is so strong for it. It's one of the main reasons it resonates so strongly for me, but that sort of detail and moral complexity can be a tough sell, even if it still offers dreams of hope. Coupled with a breadth of sound and a depth of writing that shows Isbell and his band at their very best. Folks, I don't give scores anymore, but if I did, 10. It's the best album I've heard in years. One where at any given time, any one song on it could be my favorite. Absolutely the one to beat in 2023. If you haven't heard it, give yourself an hour to listen. Another couple hours to process it. You'll need it. Yeah, it's a lot. I'll say it. It's worth it, though. And I got to admit, it's nice to know where the wind might be blowing. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. This is a tough album, and I admit I don't give out scores anymore, but hey, sometimes you need to make sure everyone knows that you are dealing with something special, and this is indeed something insanely special. If this album does not click for you on the first listen, let it sit with you. The writing, the hooks, they actually do take some time to reveal themselves. It took me a while to be absolutely sure, but when I was, again, I am. This is the album to beat in 2023. And again, if we get more albums of this tier, I will have my mind blown so many times anew. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to support the channel, or hell, maybe in July start getting albums on my schedule for me to cover, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but the option's available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.